Hello and welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I'm SoapyRao, if you're wondering who the voice is of that Soapy guy. And it's strange because Soapy seems to be a name that people can pronounce easily when they're not really able to pronounce much. Because Sandeep seems to be overwhelmingly confusing for a few people because my parents decided to give me a spelling with the U. SUNDEEP. As a result, maybe that fortuitous move really bamboozled the algorithms on Google. As a result, no one can find me when they're looking for a comedian named Sandeep. And as a result, all the other Sandeeps get the work, which is great to be anonymous. But I was thinking about this quite deeply, because there's a big wave of content now coming from India which is being recognized internationally. And of course, I'm talking about specifically in the entertainment space. Yeah, it happened with Slumdog Millionaire, but more recently, this movie which everyone's talking about, it did well at the Golden Globes, I think. It did well at the Oscars. It won Best Original Best Original Song. This, of course, is Natu Natu. I think RRR is the movie. I haven't watched it, but again, everyone's talking about it. And of course, I don't contribute to forums on the internet because I really don't think my opinion matters for much. And I'd rather do it here because I get more time and no one can actually comment, because none of you guys bother to comment and none of you seem to have contrary views to the shit I say. So I appreciate it. It's probably one of two things. Either you really agree with me or you really can't be bothered to take the time to drop an email, SoapyRao@gmail.com, or tweet or retweet or quote tweet or thumbs up or thumbs down or thumbs up the bum. Who knows? But you don't seem to care. But anyway, I appreciate it. I take your apathy as a sign and a vote of confidence, because I try to look at the glass as a pint, and that's half full. Hey, so what is going on? Someone asked me, hey, it seems that India is is making leaps and bounds in all sorts of places, is making forays into places where Indians never went before. And what is going on? I don't have an expert opinion on this, but it's more an observation I want to talk about, because this kind of boils down to the languages we have in our country. And predominantly, me being in Bangalore, growing up in Bangalore, the emphasis was always being proficient in English, because it's also kind of, I talk about this in the show I did at Edinburgh, which was called Blurred Lines, a blind Indian with a British hangover. And the word not blind, but British hangover being the operative word. Now, because I grew up in a Bangalore and in a family and in a community where speaking English well was very important, and the schools I went to were all English, and it was a standard that we were aiming to achieve, which was being fluent English speaking, but more, I don't think more importantly, but as importantly or unknowingly, English thinking individuals in a Bangalore, in a state, Karnataka, in a country, India, in the 90s and the 2000s. And that seemed to be one of India's strong points when it became the move for companies to outsource their jobs, because India has got a huge English-speaking population compared to China, and that was the point that made us win a lot more deals and get a lot more jobs shipped over here. But I feel, I'm not saying that other languages didn't have importance, because there are Kannada speakers, there are Bengali speakers, Gujarati speakers, they were there, they are there, and they're going to be there. But over the past 5-10 years maybe, I've noticed, especially in the arts, a shift, and especially in the youth, because there have been a lot of theater groups in various languages, there have been a lot of comedians in various languages, there have been a lot of musicians, of course, in various languages, and filmmakers in various languages. But I don't know what it is, but there seems to be this re-embracement of the language that you spoke. And that's the strange thing. A lot of people are like, why don't you speak Hindi? Or why don't you do shows in Kannada? Or why don't you do a podcast in Kannada? And I totally get it. I possibly can. But here's a big difference. Now, when I speak English as an Indian and I speak to, say, a person from the UK or the US or from Australia, many of them are quite surprised with my fluency or with maybe even my vocabulary at times. Very, very few people. And they're very, very sort of shocked, because they're very, very surprised that we even met. But they're the Indian accent makes our I think the command over the language, people suspect that it isn't good, which I find is, when you're put side by side with a so-called native English speaker, which I'm a native English speaker because fuck, I spoke English my whole life. I was taught English, I think in English, but you aren't as native an English speaker, say, as an American, a British person, or even an Australian, which is strange. So a lot of the countries which are sort of the old colonies of the Commonwealth, and you look at especially like Singapore, or you look at India, or you look at even some African countries, there are people who think in English there, and they, like me, are the ones who kind of are torn between two worlds, because in one way we were taught to speak this language so we can kind of present ourselves on the broader stage, on the world stage, and be on par with international talent or international workers or whatever the game was, but we wanted to be these people so we can be on par with that game. But on the other side, we kind of are also taken away from the people here in our local communities because we are seen as English speakers. And of course, a lot of people speak English, but here's my thing. Thinking in English, speaking in English, they're two different things, because you can speak in English, and a lot of Indians speak in English, but they think in a language which is not English. They're either Hindi or, as I said, other languages, and could be even in certain African dialects, could be even in certain European languages. And there is a difference, I think, being bilingual or trilingual or multilingual, is there is a certain language that you think in, and then your ability to kind of translate those thoughts into a certain other language. And of course, there are some people who are extremely special who can think in multiple languages. I haven't met them, and fuck, that's an amazing skill. But now I'm talking about this point where you're kind of not torn, but you're kind of distanced yourself from, or being pushed away from certain groups. And I think this is a problem, or rather it's a thing that's happening, where now when I present a podcast or a show in English, I'm automatically compared to a English speaker from a so-called quote-unquote native English-speaking country, whether, now again, it's those three typically that come up, right? Whether it's Australia, Japan, the US, or the UK. And it seems that you're judged based on the accent to a certain extent. I think that's changing, but also on the way you present. And it's a lot more to kind of push through to get noticed, because you are automatically sort of categorized as a comedian with an Indian accent, and as a result, you're forced to kind of make these jokes to get to that place where you can overcome that and then speak about the stuff that you want to. Now, of course, all this could be bullshit in my own head, but I think this is the case. And as a result now, what's happening is that people are finding empowerment in speaking English and creating content in the language that they think in. So as a result, you have a lot of people who are traveling abroad, who are getting their degrees, people in India as well getting their degrees, people who are interested in making films, people who are, and instead of earlier trying to say, hey, you know what, I get recognized by the festivals in the West and festivals in the East and the West, and they get these Sundance or whatever these festivals are, and these are typically, earlier the power for the course was English, but now they're happy to showcase their things, their pieces of work in the language that they think in, and as a result, you're seeing so much more authentic ideas and the translation of those ideas and the execution of those ideas coming across so effectively, because people aren't ashamed, and more importantly, people aren't trying too hard to make that into a language that is accepted, but rather making the idea in the language that they think in, and as a result finding acceptance in the purest version of that idea, which as a result comes out naturally because you're thinking that script, you're feeling that script, executing that script. And I think that's fucking fantastic. And that's why when people say, can you do shows in Kannada, I'm like, of course I can speak the language, I can go on stage and do jokes in the language, but the joke is not going to sound good or as good as my English joke, which is pretty shit in the first place, because I have to convert it into a language that I speak but I don't think in, and as a result there's a lot lost in translation. I hope that makes sense. I think it made sense in my head while I thought about it, but sometimes, see, if I had to do this in Kannada, there would be 2 iterations before you heard it, before it hit your ears, but there's a little less, and I hope that makes the information, makes the ideas a little bit more clearer and makes it a little more connected to the listener, that being you. And I'm glad that there's this huge sort of establishment of not being worried about which language, but more engaged in the idea and how you can communicate that in its purest or most authentic or most natural or most original form, and language being one of them. I'm so glad that people are doing that, and people with great ideas have always been everywhere. There are a lot more people with shitty ideas. Fortunately, they stick to Instagram and TikTok. But the ones with truly good ideas are not afraid anymore. They're not ashamed anymore, and they're not trying anymore to kind of appease a certain group of critics or people or audience that they thought they had to by presenting their ideas in a language that was globally accepted. But I feel now people with technology, with the power of platforms that are distributing content in different languages, they're able to get their ideas in the truest form to people who are willing to consume it. And I think that's fucking fantastic. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on the issue, and congratulations to those guys from RRR. I think they are really killing it, and that's pretty awesome for the rest of, regional Indian cinema, and I think independent filmmakers and a lot of other artists who are trying to get their stuff out to the world. So well done, boys and girls and grandmothers and grandfathers. Let me talk about my guest today before I ramble on. I've got a very interesting person to talk to me today. He's a comedian. Well, we interacted at the Edinburgh Fringe back in 2017. He hosted a show I was on called The Best of the Fringe or something like that. I don't know. It was a name that was clearly getting people in and sending them out quicker. But Dave Chawner is a stand-up comic and an author, and in today's conversation we chat about the landscape of comedy for him in the UK, how things have evolved, and this kind of fits in, right, with language and how you have to say things that need to be said, how you have to say things that want to be heard, how you have to say things that might please you but don't please the audience. And as a result, there's a lot of stuff to navigate, there's a lot of stuff to think about, there's a lot of stuff to hold back on. And as a result, do you become more responsible? Do you become more restricted? Do you become more accepted? Do you become more celebrated? So there's so many things that do happen. And for a person who wants to really look at the career moves, there is a certain path. For a person who just truly wants to be funny and free, there's a different path or lack of. And for a person who just doesn't give a fuck, there's also a path or lack of. So we talk about that and a whole lot more. We talk about his book. We talk about how Dave dealt with anorexia and how he accepted the fact that he had to consider that this is a part of him, but how he can also move on and help people by writing the book that he did. The link to the book is in the description. Please do go check it out and check out Dave's work on wherever he puts it up. I think that's typically YouTube, and you can follow him on social media. Well, without further ado, here's my guest on today's episode. I hope you enjoy it because I enjoyed chatting with Mr. Dave Chawner. Thank you, as always, for listening to this podcast. Till next week, goodbye, God bless, take care of yourselves. Cheers. Dave, excuse me. Dave Chawner, welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure having you here.
Thank you so much. I realise that it's been a bit of a hassle getting me here, but you have persevered, which I think props to you for that.
Hey, absolutely. It's always fun to reconnect with someone who I shared a stage with. I think it's now closing on 6 years at the Fringe.
6 years ago.
Yeah, 2017. That's when I met you at the Fringe, and we did those shows at the, I forget which room that was, the nightclub in the basement, which smelled of centuries of beer.
I mean, that's not really narrowing it down for Edinburgh, is it? It's always a nightclub that's like falling apart and smells of beer and sick.
Yeah, I felt pretty, honestly speaking, it was a pretty claustrophobic entrance. You walk down those stairs, and then especially when shows are leaving and the other shows are coming in, you have this entire sort of clusterfuck at the level, and you're like, oh my god, if there's a fire here, and I'm coming from India, I should be worried. I mean, I should be used to this idea, but I was scared for a moment there.
I once had, and it really opened my eyes, a woman in, I think it was Cabaret Voltaire downstairs, and a woman did actually have a panic attack, because you're absolutely right. These really confined old spaces, and people coming in, coming and going. I mean, before COVID, we always talked about fringe flu, but when the pandemic hit, it did make a lot of things seem weird. And one of the biggest things that I did think was, oh my God, like that festival must have been a breeding ground for all types of bacteria.
Man, you know, I think one of the days I had to go from the gig that you were hosting, which was, I think, the Best of the Fringe, or to another show which was down the road, and I really needed to take a shit, right? And I was like, well, I can't go back to my apartment, so where do I go? So I used the toilet at this bar, and I was like, man, they need to up their game. This is filthy. Like I literally wouldn't be surprised if like a virus would originate from that. It was so horrific.
It's just, and it's also like the kind of city, I love it, and it's part of the grunginess and stuff, but it does make me laugh that the city kind of gives up even caring, and like, that's just take me as you take me, you know, that's it.
No, I mean, you're right, the grunginess, but it's borderline it's borderline dangerous, right? With, I don't know, man. Oh, but it's nice.
You can make a real interesting documentary, like, about all of the worst toilets in Edinburgh. I think would you say that was the worst shit that you've ever had?
It was the most tentative, you know. I couldn't. Because my wife was waiting outside, and she's like, go ahead, just use the disabled loo. And I'm like, I think this is disabled. I don't think this. Because it was, as you said, I think the people who maintained the place just stopped caring. So there was no toilet paper.
Yeah.
It was, let's not go into details, but it was probably in the top 3 worst kind of locations, if you need to ask. Singapore, in fact, also had some pretty crappy toilets. I'm surprised because
really,
at some of these bars, and I tried making an effort not to take a shit in comedy clubs or bars, because it's not really the ideal location. But sometimes you got to go, especially if you're out the whole day doing shows at the Fringe, or sometimes, and the thing in bars is usually after a few drinks, you don't care, but, it was during the daytime, so you kind of are a little bit more heightened with your senses. So, I like how this conversation started with taking shits. This is brilliant.
Great. and also, you instantly sound so much better traveled than me. Like, taking a shit in Singapore, and all I've got is like, I went to Essex the other day and took a bad shit, very different.
That's the thing in India. People are like, oh, you probably are used. Yeah, there are some really, really, toilets across the board, and the average toilet isn't clean. Of course, a lot of people don't even have access to clean, not even clean, but closed plumbing. But since I'm from here, I kind of know, and that's the weird thing, traveling as an Indian. When you're in India, you kind of have a higher standard that you get used to, because you make an effort to at least keep that on your radar, right? Whether it's home, whether it's friends' homes, whether it's hotels or bars, you kind of go to the nicer ones, and you kind of get used to that. But when you travel as an Indian abroad, you're kind of no longer, not to sound elitist, but you're no longer used to that, or the stuff that gives you that level is much more expensive. So then you're kind of using the average plumbing, which I was talking to you about before this, the average, which is usually much higher in countries like the UK, the US, or other countries in Europe. And you kind of are like, it's fine. Like the stuff that I kind of would do on a higher level of expectation here, I'm okay to settle for the average there because it's of a higher standard. But it seems to have dropped.
I think that epitomizes the UK in a sentence. It seems to have dropped. It feels. I think the UK at the moment feels very much like a sort of celebrity that used to be at the height of their fame, and now has started doing Strictly Come Dancing on Ice, or those terrible reality TV shows just to be like, love me, I still am on telly. That's what the UK is at the moment.
Like kind of grasping at straws before going to rehab.
Yes. Yeah, I think come back to me in 2 years and we'll see if the UK is in rehab at the moment. Because I think across the world it is a politically tumultuous time. But what is it like in India at the moment? Is there a sort of sense of cohesion? Because I think that's one of the things that the UK is missing, is a sense of direction.
It's hard to explain in a short sort of
Mm,
description, because um, it's such a vast set of variables, right? Because you do, on a sense, have a sense of cohesion. Otherwise, 1+ billion people, if there's no cohesion, we'd probably be at each other's necks. Um, but because there's also such a wide divide when it comes to literacy, when it comes to socioeconomic measures, there is a lot of scope for kind of seeding um, misinformation and brainwashing, and kind of pitching
mm,
groups against each other, communal, and especially on a religious front. A lot of people on the political sort of side are using that to kind of also leverage social media to kind of drive this message of divide. So yeah, if you look at any media outlet, which you probably shouldn't, because they kind of, in many ways, kind of sensationalize only the top 10% of what gathers eyeballs. So if you look at that, whether it's the UK or India, I think you get a sense of, oh my God, the country's up in arms. But life goes on, pretty much. If you go to your local vegetable shop, he's happy to be alive, like just like anyone else in the world, or you go meet it's tough, of course. India is a tough country. We have people minimum wage, you have people who are struggling every day. But I think the adversity makes people here, and have for years made people here, a lot more resilient, and kind of at least look at what they do have. But with social media, I
mm.
feel there's a lot of dissatisfaction, or possibility for dissatisfaction being seeded in people.
I think that's interesting. There's so many thoughts on that, but I think one of them is that appreciation, that does seem to be a word that is sort of missing at the moment.
Mm,
Of people can always look for what's wrong rather than what is right,
mm,
and it is interesting at the moment. I do feel that whether it is a product of having rolling news, or having social media, or having so many different outlets with free access to the internet,
mm,
it really does feel that the minority views are getting a lot more airtime than
mm.
those majority views that make up most people.
And I think the everyone's, of course, entitled to feeling wronged, I suppose. But there's a sense that everyone has an outburst of anger, frustration, sorrow, and dejection. But it almost feels like only that is picked up on, as opposed to the other
Mm,
part, which is, of course, man, everyone has shit happening to them. They manage, they kind of, for the most part, live in a middle ground. But it seems like we want to pick, and that being we, being the media or social media, pick on only the extremes, that's the lows or the highs, and make that into either reality show, or make that into an Insta reel, or make that into a TikTok, whatever it's called. And it's another thing, I think, is people obviously knew that in India there's disparity, there's extreme poverty, there's extreme wealth, and there's a lot in the middle. But earlier you'd see, a Rolls Royce next to a rickshaw. But now what's happened, I feel, is a person in the rickshaw and the person in the Rolls has a smartphone, and now with a click of a photo, you can actually tell, the person in the rickshaw can see the value, the worth, how much, how kind of vulgar that
mm.
kind of money is, and that kind of information without the ability to kind of even go up one notch in life is very, very frustrating, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you nailed it there with frustration, because I think you're right that we do polarize emotions such as anger or aggression, or even depression on the other side of that
Yeah.
spectrum. But I think there's a lot of very murky emotions that don't get any airtime. For example, things like envy doesn't
Mm.
generally get talked about that much at all, which I find really, really fascinating. Because, yeah, you're right. We talk about anger or people being a diva, but very rarely do we talk about them being jealous or
Yeah.
them feeling a failure. It's just a very interesting thing that,
And even self-loathing,
again,
it's such a demonized thing,
mm,
but it's something that you can overcome. And that's not, and people aren't told how to do it. They're just told that, if you're insecure, then become secure. If you're
mm,
jealous, then you're a bad person. I mean, it's so black and white, right? If you're depressed,
mm,
then get it fixed. But there's so many, as you said, nuances to all these things that are the experience of being a human being, right? It's all natural. We all go through it, but we're not told, or rather given the kind of tools to deal with it. And that's the problem. That's why we kind of look to influencers or look at podcast gurus to kind of say, hey, give me a solution or give me a book that'll help me, which is, of course, great resources. But if you aren't able to kind of identify that, you have these things and you want to fix it, it's very difficult, a very difficult premise to approach, right?
It really is, because I think that there's just too much stuff. And like, you go back 500 years. I've been a farmer. I've been in a field. As long as I got like water, food, my family, and a roof over my head, that's fine. But now, you can't even go to a coffee shop without thinking, are these beans fair trade? Are they ethically sourced? Are they free range? Have they been beans that have been running around in the field? And then it's like, what sort of milk do you want? Do you want dairy? Oof. Do you want oat? Do you want soy? Do you want human milk? It's kind of like all of these things there's just so many decisions right now, and I think people are really craving simplicity. And when you're looking at emotions are very rarely simple. For example, self-loathing, when it is on the spectrum of like, that's being crippling, that's debilitating. But then on the other side as well, if you think you are perfect, you're also going to be an absolute asshole.
Absolutely. And I mean, we come to your book because you address a lot of these things through your experience. But, one thing I find is this generation of people who, as you said, there's too much stuff, but there's also a lot of knowledge to be had, a lot of information easily accessible, right? So I feel a lot of people know, but they don't really feel. So if you ask someone, they're quick to kind of define or give definitions of what they're going through. Oh, I'm anxious. Oh, I have this issue. Or they give all the right terms, the right concepts. But how many of them actually feel from within, as opposed to kind of just hiding behind these concepts,
I couldn't agree more. And there is a huge difference between knowledge and intellect, because I think a lot of people are just gaining all of these things of, I should say this, I should believe that, I should tell people I think that, but actually putting that into practice, actually being pragmatic about it, I think it's a waning skill at the moment. And I think, again, we're getting polarized into like left and right. And funny enough, I did an interview only this morning, and I was like, I find it quite weird what certain people consider left wing and right wing. And actually, all we mean is, I like this or I don't like that. It's that kind of othering of like, because I don't think global warming is a left or a right wing thing. It's got nothing to do with politics. Yet all of a sudden it's become seen as a more left thing, which is odd.
It's so ridiculous when you hear these stories on the news, right? Like, I'll give you an example. It's nothing to do with global warming, but just to the level of how low the media has stooped in India. Of course, it's just an example, which is India, but I'm sure it's there everywhere in the world. Is, I think, a few months back, I think last November, there's this guy who works with this really, really big company. I think it was either Wells Fargo or one of those kind of financial things.
Wow.
And this Indian guy, and Indians love a person in a senior corporate position, right? Like when Sundar Pichai became the CEO of Google, everyone's like, "Oh my God, India!" Like, we just love celebrating. It's a thing. Like, we love it, celebrating academic prowess. Like, oh my God, he's a PhD. Oh my God, he's gone to Harvard. Oh my God, he's working here. And it's just a thing that we've had in our culture, right? So this guy is, I don't know what position at this company. He's traveling back on an Indian carrier, Air India, in business class. And this is the story. The news story is that he got so drunk that he actually pissed on one of the passengers. And so he literally got up off his seat and went across to a 70-plus-year-old lady and peed on her. Dude, this is the news story. Now, it's, of course, pretty stupid, right? But the way the media picked up on it, and they're picking up on how she's filed a case and how he's now defending himself, and how the lawyer said, no, he didn't pee on her. She has incontinence. She pissed herself. This is what news minutes are being occupied by. Now, personally, I think you and I as comedians, we take the comic take, like, what was her feeling, right? Like, was she having a nice warm dream of a golden shower, and like suddenly she wakes up to this Indian MBA dude pissing on her? Like, who knows? Maybe it was her fantasy. But it's for comedians to kind of decipher, not for journalists to kind of waste, like, getting experts on, what do you think by the color of his pee that he was feeling? I don't know. It's ridiculous, dude. But
But that's what I love as well, is especially when media do that. They literally take an idea and squeeze all of the fun out of it. So you're going,
yeah,
so
every
what's it?
droplet, no pun intended.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what's well, what's the economic impact of this on Google and all of
Yeah.
this sort of stuff? And I think that's
Did
brilliant.
the CEO of Air India issue an apology? Like, dude, like this guy was pissed. I mean, I'm sure you've got pissed drunk people at your show, and you've got pissed drunk people everywhere, and pissed drunk people do what pissed drunk people do. But is it necessary to escalate it to this level? And then, of course, everyone talking, profiling this guy. What does it mean to be young in India? The arrogance of the youth. Like, oh my, it's just ridiculous, dude. And I found it. I mean, honestly, I found it pretty fucking funny. But even if you say, and I think that sort of leads me into asking you the next question. Um, with all
Have I
this
ever
going
pissed on
on,
anyone in a flight?
no, I think being in university, we've all done our share of pissing in public places, right? And let's not go into those details. And we've had those. It was silly fun, right? But with that kind of humor now is where is humor? And I think okay, let's talk about that first. I think what is your sense? Because comedians are typically looked at or were looked at as the people who kind of take these issues, whether it's political, whether it's daily, whether it's cultural, and kind of break it down with obviously their perspective and make it funny, whether it suits people, whether it upsets people, and let's use the word offends people. It's a thing that needs to be said. But clearly now there is a certain realm for humor, and those boundaries should not be crossed, or it shouldn't spill outside that realm. And what's your take on where we are today?
So I think in terms of, so I've got 2 points on this. I think it's really important to consider the sort of the power dynamic. So, like, for example, if I was to do a set about what it's like to be partially sighted or blind, I'm lucky enough I wear glasses, but that's not the same as you would have a very different take of that, because you are coming from a place of knowledge, of experience, of having lived that thing. So I think that is something that's really important to say. And whether you are punching down or punching up, so whether you are sort of being critical of people in power, or whether you are actually just bullying people, i.e. sort of people who are disabled, people that don't have a platform or can't stand up for themselves. And I always used to say this of, sort of like, I don't believe in cancel culture, but I do think that there has become a problem that, because it is becoming tribal in how people are thinking. I've only noticed this in the past couple of weeks, that people are not even becoming offended. I wouldn't even use the word offended, because I'd say that offense is quite a private thing. But people are almost like signaling, I shouldn't like that, to other people, which I do find curious. And I always say, I think it's better to live in a time where people are thoughtful and are thinking about other people, potentially those that can't speak up for themselves. I think it's going to take comedy in particular in a very interesting angle. Is it something that you're concerned about as well?
Yeah. Because I feel the whole punching up, punching down, I get it, right? If you are like, say in India, the punching down scenario is different from the UK, because the circumstances of who you're punching down are different, but it's still punching down, right? But like, for instance, I remember someone telling me at the Comedy Store in Bombay, this I think a British comedian came and he made a joke about how at our traffic lights, that these people who come begging to the car, and often it's young girls or children who are sent out to beg, and of course it's a racket. It's an entire sort of organized kind of racket by these kind of so-called mafia kind of people. But he did a joke about how something about I would say it's more than punching down, it was distasteful, which I think is a appropriate thing to find in a joke, because it's about her poverty and how he's in a better position and how he can use his better position, and it didn't go well. Now, does it mean he's a bad person? I don't know him, so I can't call him a bad person. But does it mean he should be banned? No. But I think the joke was bad, and I think the joke was distasteful. And similarly, I think everyone makes mistakes when you're writing jokes, because you sometimes cross the line, and that's perfectly fine, because everyone crosses the line at their job. And only problem is our jobs are constantly being evaluated live and in front of people all the time. But one thing I've been told in the past is, oh, why don't you play the blind card more? Why don't you kind of be the blind comedian? That way you get picked up by various groups. You can go on these talent shows and you can play that card. And I'm like, it was, after it was told to me 10 times, I'm like, maybe there's something in this branding thing. But it never appealed to me, because I feel, not to sound arrogant, but I feel I'm more than just that, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I have this perspective because, I can't see. That's pretty much one sense which I don't have. But I can't deny it, but at the same time, I'm not going to celebrate it, because what's the point, right? I have so much other stuff in my life, which, and yes, I can't talk about driving, and I can't talk about doing things that sighted people do, but I do have a perspective in this world, which does come kind of shaped by a lack of perfect vision, or for the most part, lack of lot of vision. But I'm not going to only harp on that. I mean, it's going to crop up here and there in my set, but I have other stuff to talk about. And I feel that is being taken away from people, because they're kind of being boxed into a certain label that people expect them to talk about. And I find that very strange, because it's really cool if you're disabled, you'll be celebrated on certain talent shows, but that's where you belong. Don't go beyond that. And I find that to be a problem. That message to be a problem.
I think that boxing thing is a really good thing to pick up on, and I'll give you an example of this. I was doing a gig only the other day, and I do worry that this idea of offense, or idea of trying to sort of show that moral piety, has become a badge of honor. So this is a genuine thing that happened. I was emceeing, and I went on stage, and there was a couple in the front row, and it was absolutely lovely. And I was just chatting, and I was like, oh my goodness, like, how did you guys meet? And the girl said, because it was a heterosexual couple, the girl said, I was at the bar, and he came over to me to talk. And someone from the left-hand side of the room went, oh my God.
Oh God.
And I was like, sorry, what? And she was like, well, that, and I think she implied something about rape culture, or sort of said like, oh, that she's a vulnerable girl in a bar. And I was like, she didn't say, oh yeah, I was in a bar, he got his dick out and came over to me. That is offense worthy. But that's how people used to meet. And I find that odd.
And that's the really weird part, right? That we use, like, I remember a friend who's not even a comedian, but because people watch comedy now, I think they have a right to say people are funny or not, but they go beyond that, right? Whether it's like, if I listen to music, doesn't mean I go tell John Mayer how to write a song, right? Or I critique how a musician should be. I shouldn't, like, okay, because I listen to 5 hours of Spotify, it doesn't mean I can enter a debate with other musicians saying, no, this is what it means to be a musician. That's bullshit. I feel there should be a line where, if you don't know too much about it, yeah, you can appreciate a joke, or you can get pissed off with a joke, but it doesn't mean how you tell comedians or actors or artists how to do their fucking job. And I think that's the problem now. Everyone thinks they can tell artists how to do their job, because that's what they appreciate, or what they don't appreciate. And I think that's where you draw the line, because, hey, artists are so different, and each person has a different kind of expression, and each person has something they find interesting, funny, revealing, whatever it may be, inflammatory, but that's their right as an artist to do. And the society needs all of it to make it more diverse and inclusive, because that's what diversity and inclusion is, right? It's all of it, and none of it should be kind of taken away because a certain person says, oh, that's not my cup of tea,
But I think with that inclusion, I think also there should be an inclusion of saying, oh, that's not in my wheelhouse. How often do you get people nowadays saying, oh, I don't know about that? And I think the problem with things like social media, etc., is that it makes everyone feel that they have to have an opinion on everything. Whereas like with politics, like, I don't know. A great example of this, and it sounds like a name drop, it's absolutely not meant to be, but this is relevant to the kind of the context, is that I was emceeing another club the other day, and Russell Howard was opening. Now he's one of the biggest comics in the UK, and very sort of famous over here.
He's really exploded, right? Yeah.
Yeah, big time. And he's like going on to do a world tour. Lovely guy, genuinely an incredible comic. And I sort of said, went on, did my bit, blah blah blah, and said, "Ladies and gents, please welcome to the stage Russell Howard." Now everyone kind of went mad. It was brilliant. I went outside, and as I was walking to the wings, a girl stopped me, and I said, "Oh, come into the green room, have a chat." And she just said, "Oh, I didn't find that joke that you did about Ireland funny." And there was kind of like a pregnant pause, and I was like, "Okay," and she was like, "I just thought I should let you know." And it was only later when I told someone this, I was like, it's such a weird moment. I was like, you have left the room, so you're not going to see one of the most famous living British comedians that is working in our time, just to tell me. And it wasn't like I'm offended. It wasn't you shouldn't say this. It wasn't said you said anything wrong. It was just, oh, I didn't like that joke. And it's such a weird thing to say. And I do feel lucky that doing stand-up, it gives you an outlet for all of those emotions. Perhaps that's what's going on. Perhaps people that don't have a creative outlet now feel that social media has given them a platform to just tell people that, and by extension they're just going around all the time kind of it just seems so odd just to say, oh, I didn't like that joke. I'm like, okay.
You know what that sort of sounds like? It's almost like, I'm going to say this, and at the risk of maybe pissing off people, but you don't really need, okay, you need to be smart, or you need to be a little strategic with being successful on social media. And I'm not saying as a YouTube video creator or a blogger, I'm saying with Reels. So I feel what's happening is people can become quote unquote famous by replicating stuff out there, or by making a quick TikTok reel or an Insta reel and get a lot of people to say, wow, that's hilarious, or share it, and make these kind of huge leaps in kind of the fame category, and then get influencer status or whatever, right? Not for their talent, but just for being smart about what they do. But then a person who writes a joke doesn't really get much fame, because it's a weird world, say. So this person feels, oh, you know what, I'm famous, it gives me a chance or a right to say something about someone else's art or performance or talent. And I think that's absolute bullshit, because if you don't like something, you don't like it. You don't have to kind of pipe up and kind of give your thoughts, because I don't think anyone wants to hear like, yeah, you know what, there are musicians who you like and I like who've gone through bad phases, right? Like someone's like, oh, U2's this album is shit. It's not like I'm going to go meet Bono and say, hey, Bono, you know what? it just sounds stupid, right? I mean, with whatever, like, even if I don't like, if I don't like a band, I won't listen to them until someone says, hey, you might like them now. They've evolved into this kind of particular version of what their music is. And it's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine to bitch about that music with your friends. But does it give you the right to go up to the musician and say, hey, here's a suggestion. Why don't you try electronic from classic rock? Like, come on, right? This sounds ridiculous. But because, say, you and I or other comedians who aren't the Chappelles of the world or the Ricky Gervaises of the world, we are in their eyes, I think, because they also know that Netflix and Amazon is not going to buy the funniest special. They're going to buy the special with of a comedian who's got the most followers on social media. And that validates that social media is more important, or your social media footprint is more important than your true talent or your true art or your true way of expressing it. And I think that's a problem.
Oh, absolutely. Well, my agent the other day said, yeah, you should go on TikTok. And genuinely, it's one of the nicest things that I've ever... In that moment, I went, absolutely not. I don't need any more social media in my life. And genuinely, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. And
it's
I was
so liberating.
Mate, it's beautiful.
I just hate... I felt so pressured, man. I mean, it's kind of in the past, fortunately, but kind of being a certain version of yourself for a certain social media platform, and that opens you up. Like a social media a marketing person say, oh, your jokes won't work on social media, you need to write jokes about this, and there'll be a point I'm like, oh sure, I need to change for social media, and I feel like such a jackass even thinking back at what I would say. And that's what it is. Like, you're pulling your hair, trying to be on every platform, trying to be the quickest to the punch, the funniest, the most compact, the most concise. And what does that do to you? It tears your mind apart, right? Because you're not really doing...
All it is a popularity contest. Yeah. I've always said, humans don't grow up, they just get taller. And to give an example of that, I remember, and it's like, I'm not going to come across as holier than thou. I'm just as bad as people, because I think sometimes you get fed this idea so much that you accidentally start thinking, oh, I want that. But it's just been, a great example of this was when I was growing up, yo-yos became a massive craze. And I remember being at home trying to like do this one trick on a yo-yo, and I hated it. It was like doing homework that was never going to get marked. And I just remember having a conversation with myself and being like, well, look, if you don't like doing no one's making you do yo-yos, Dave. Yeah. And it's exactly the same with social media. I feel like a lot of people feel they have to be on there because that's what you're told. But actually, if that ain't your thing, that ain't your thing.
Yeah. And I feel it's not just the audience, even the comedians are, I think from what I hear, it's generally like there's this kind of smugness going, you know what, I'm a comedian, I'm a reflection on society. I'm like, come on, you're just a person telling jokes, man. I mean, really beyond that, like when you hear people like on podcasts, whoever it may be, from mid kind of popular to even really popular, it's just too much noise, right? Like you have these people like, oh, James Acaster took a pot shot at Ricky Gervais, and Ricky Gervais then or Will Smith slapped Chris Rock. What does the world think? I'm like, are you fucking serious? This stuff doesn't deserve attention, man. Because comedians are just supposed to get up there. I mean, I remember like, The Fringe, you see some of the funniest comedians who get absolutely no recognition, but then you get some of the people who are so perfectly marketed that they get the best reviews, they get the best kind of deals. And it has nothing to do with funny. It's just about marketing. But actual funny is raw funny, right? I mean, I could be completely off point with this, but this is what I feel like. When you're on a stage telling jokes, what's your job? Not to change society. It's to be funny at that point, right?
I genuinely can't tell you how like lovely that is to hear, because the amount of podcasts and stuff that I do where people will start using terms like zeitgeist and all of these kind of things and going like, yeah, well, actually the true comedian is the reflection back at society in the mirror that they didn't realize was there. It's like, it's not. It's just telling dick jokes a lot of the time, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I do. You can over intellectualize this stuff in order to
try and make it over important, like right?
God.
Give yourself a more larger kind of like a mantle that you need, because and when that happens, and I think that's the thing, right? Typically, all this stuff would be done by non-comedians. Like, you'd sit down and break down Bill Hicks' set, going, "Oh, he didn't mean this. He was beyond his time. He was beyond." Yeah. Oh, you look at Mitch Hedberg. He was so crazy, man. He was in his own head. And then you have people taking LSD to become Mitch Hedberg. I'm like, what the fuck's wrong with you guys? And then you have. And then you have the other people who say shit because they know it's going to get people upset. And I'm like, come on, man, don't have to do a feminist bit just because. And as you said sometime earlier, experience, right? Most of these guys don't have an experience on the topics they're talking about, but they're doing it because they know they'll get that shock value, and they might go viral because someone takes a clip and says, oh, this guy said this about this, and oh my God, he gets his 2 seconds of fame.
So, I honestly, I 100% believe that there's that phrase, and this is wanky, there's that phrase, the dawning of knowledge is the realization of ignorance. And I've noticed that the people that are generally better in their field, and I'm not only talking about comedy, I'm talking about medicine. Great example of this, my mom was a nurse, which is great, and obviously we need nurses, etc. And when COVID and the vaccine was coming around, we were talking about this. And I'd had a conversation the day before with one of my mates who is quite a senior surgeon now. And he's written a number of papers. He's like on this breakthrough for kidney cancer. And I talked to him about the vaccine, and I was just like, it's really exciting. How's it work? And he was like, mate, I work in kidney cancer. Like I have literally no idea. Like I have, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a virologist. I don't know anything. I spoke to my mom, who'd like been a sort of general nurse, which is great. And she was like, well, the thing that people don't realize, and there's a guy here, Chris Whitty, who's the chief medical officer. And she genuinely turned around and went, the thing that Chris Whitty has got wrong about the vaccine is, and I was like, wait, Mom, I'm going to stop you there. He's got the British Medical Academy behind him. He's got every surgeon, every doctor, every epidemiologist and virologist. I think he's got this one covered. And it does show that the people that are most likely to say, oh, I don't know, are actually probably the ones that are sort of more top of their game because they're not pretending.
Yeah. And we're sitting in 2023, and 2019 I would be that guy, that comedian who would kind of stand up for stand up, which is absolute horseshit. Stand up doesn't need champions. It it doesn't need people going on news shows or podcasts saying no, stand up will survive. Stand up is about, like, it's not required. It's more than 100 years old in this form. It's more than 1,000 years old as humor. It's never going to die. It's just that I don't know why people take the title of stand up so seriously. It's almost like and even people like as they come to find out you're a comedian. Oh, you're a comedian. How cool. I'm like, it's not really. It's nice.
Well,
I enjoy it,
I've
but it's
got
not cool.
I've got a little bit of insight into that, and this is my meek thought on that, and this
Yeah, of
might
course.
be completely wrong. But I think the reason for that is also the reason that I personally, generally, and I don't get on it too much, but I try never to introduce myself as comedian, because that's not something that you do, it's something that you are. And nobody is funny 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. It's something you do, in the same way that if you're a singer, you don't go around the house going, I'm going to go take a massive shit right now. Like,
Yeah,
of
yeah.
course you don't. And I think that for
So
a
you're
lot
basically
of
saying a
people,
comedian is what you do, not who you are, right?
yeah, like I always say I'm a comic because
Yeah,
it's my job. It's not my identity label. And I think that is
yeah.
the nub of it, that people can get very pretentious about comedy, because, me included, you can kind of, especially with all of this information, be like, who am I? Because people are trying to box themselves off, as we were saying earlier on, of I'm the social media influencer, I am the doctor, I am the stand-up comedian. That's become their identity label. And actually, I think identity is a lot more difficult than that.
I want to ask you something. When the lockdown hit, the pandemic hit, and then the lockdown happened, I think the UK was pretty strict, and I remember like a lot of artists struggled. What was your thought when the idea of not performing became a reality? So, as a person who's um, been doing stand up, you have this idea of you are as good as your last show, and you're afraid that you lose that feeling on stage, or at least comedians talk about that, right? Not getting stage time, and not working out material, and kind of scared about losing touch. I mean, this is banter within the comedy circles, right? I want to ask you, because I have a thought on this, but I want to get your take on it. What was your the feeling when you were told that you can't gig?
Well, there's and then there's like a PRD answer, and the PRD answer is always like, oh my god, I felt like my soul had been taken away and that I was wilting like a flower. Genuinely, my honest answer is I felt fucking huge relief, mate, because I kind of was like, I don't have to book, I'm not missing out on anything, this is great. Obviously there was financial worry, there was blah blah blah, but in terms of actual stand-up as like a craft and an art itself, I was like, this is fucking brilliant. Like, because I can use this as an excuse of, like, after COVID, if I don't rise up as quickly as possible, because that was a pandemic, wasn't it? I felt absolute relief. And I've spoken to so many people that have said that, but nobody wants to be the first to admit it, because everyone wants to say, oh my God, it was like my baby had been taken away. I was like, absolutely, I'm gonna have fucking piss it up the wall and have a lovely time.
Absolutely. And it's such a nice thing to hear, and kind of resonates with what because that's what happened. 2020, I recorded a special and put it up on YouTube, and yeah, I didn't do much, but I was stuck in that conversation which you just mentioned, right? Like when you talk about stand up, like it's such a philosophical extension of your being, and you're in this kind of this echo chamber. That's a nice word, like a clusterfuck with other comedians who are just like, oh, what we do is important, and then it goes into the nitty gritties, like why don't we get Netflix, or what's wrong with the machine and the industry of comedy. It's such horseshit, man. But 3 years later, I haven't done as many shows. I'm still not back on stage doing public shows. I've done a few corporate shows because the money's good, but I really feel awesome, and I'm in no rush to go back on stage, because I'm like, you know what? There's no such thing as, this and I think that comes with a sense, a little bit of been doing it and also getting a little wiser as I get a little older, is if if I have to, I have funny in me, and I don't have to go out back into the world as a stand-up comedian. If I have humor in me, there are multiple ways of expressing it, and I don't want to be confined anymore to that label. And that feels so good to say.
Oh, mate, I've always said this. It's really interesting because I teach comedy courses and stuff now, and I always ask them, what do you think is the most important thing for comedy? And 9 times out of 10, it's only ever happened 2 or 3 times that people haven't given the answer, and it would always be confidence. Now, I personally disagree with that being the thing, but I just think that's really important. That's a really interesting thing, that's what people think is the most important thing about confidence. But then I'll always ask, like, what do you mean by confidence? And generally people will say, well, being the loudest person in the room, being like that kid at the back of the class. And I'm like, to be honest, for me, that ain't confidence. That's insecurity.
Yeah.
For me, genuine confidence is being quiet and is being enough for yourself and not trying to sell yourself to other people or tell people how great you are.
And yeah, how long have you been doing stand-up for?
With little to absolutely no success. I've been doing it for 13 years. And that is something that I'm really insecure about.
That's the same as me. 2009 is when I got on stage for the first time. So I think around the same time, right? Or maybe yours a little.
Do you feel a little bit like, when you mention that, is that something that you kind of feel a little bit sort of queasy about?
I did. When I hit the 10-year mark, I was like, what do I have to show? I haven't got any big deal. I haven't got a manager. I haven't got a company representing me. Frankly speaking, that was in 2019. We're sitting 4 years later, and man, I am so glad it's worked out the way it has, because yes, of course, you get a lot more work when you're represented and managed by someone. But along with that, you also get a lot of stuff you don't want to do, because now you're a commodity that makes money for a bigger company, and you're making other people money through the commissions. And then you're constantly, I'll give you an example. So 2020, I think end of 2020, I was approached by this big sort of production company slash artist management company. And this guy called me up because he wanted me to do a certain podcast, because they wanted someone who was visually impaired, funny, and can host a podcast. It pretty much was like, wait, I tick all 3 boxes, right? And so then he starts getting into this conversation, and he says, oh, this will be fun. I think you can really pull it off. This is stories about blah, blah, blah. I don't want to go into details because of signing some stuff. And then he says, by the way, I can manage you as well, man. My company can manage you. And I said, and then he sends over a couple of non-disclosure stuff, the contracts, and of course, at this point I was a little wiser. I wasn't the eager comedian who wants to just sign anywhere and just get more gigs. I was like, you know what? I'm going to be a little bit more discreet about what I take up, because I really want to spend time with people who matter, and as opposed to just running across the country or the world, just doing things because other people tell me that's what I need to do for my career. So I pushed back on points because it was really ridiculous terms. Anyway, so fast forward to a couple of conversations later, this guy turns around and says, hey, buddy, by the way, do you realize that you don't need me. Sorry, I don't need you. You need me, because you're a nobody. And if you don't do this podcast, I can get someone else who can pretend to be visually impaired and host the podcast. And, someone else can write the jokes. And trust me, with every rupee you make, I need 99 paisa to promote it. And you are absolutely nothing without me. And just the way he spoke, and I said, I didn't fight back. I didn't yell. I didn't slam the phone. I said, you know what? Talk as much shit as you want, because until stuff is in writing, none of it matters. It's just you kind of being a prick talking big. So I let him speak his stuff. And then I said, you know what? I'll get back to you. Or I just didn't even say anything. 3 months later, he calls again. He's like, what's happening with this? And, I said, no, I don't want to go forward with this. But that's the kind of conversation when you're trapped by a contract, or when you're signing into things because you only see the 10% of the positive without the 90% of the other bullshit that comes with it,
And also there's the bigger consideration. Do you want to work with someone that's going to treat you like that?
Exactly. And many people don't know that, right? When you sign a contract with the big dogs in the industry, they are, of course, it's going to do good for you, but they are also completely in control of your career. And you might sign on as a comedian. The next thing they tell you, go on as a juggler on Britain's Got Talent. You have to do it, right?
Well, apparently, I carry out this with apparently, but there's a very famous story of Steve Coogan, who plays Alan Partridge, who's quite big out here. Apparently, he was doing the Pleasance Reserve years ago, and it was Addison Cresswell who headed up off the curb, I think it was, and basically Steve Coogan had a real coke habit. This is all third-hand information.
Right.
Not being slanderous. And apparently he had a real coke habit, and he ended up having heart arrhythmia and going to hospital during the middle of the Fringe. And apparently Addison Cresswell turned up, or someone. I mean, I'm not 100% it was him, but anyway, his agent turned up and said, "Oh my God, are you all right? I heard that you're in hospital." And turned up to the hospital bed, and Steve Coogan was there, and he was like, "Yeah, man, bit scary, but it's the nerves that got to me." And then apparently their agent turned around and went, "Good, well, you're gonna get out of the fucking hospital bed because we've sold £14,000 worth of tickets, and if you're not at that show, then you'll be paying me that." And you're like, wow. Ooh. When the chips are down, who's really got your back? And I think I've always said this, I would 100%, and this actually comes from my partner rather than me, I would prefer to work with people that I like and people that I enjoy with, rather than, we always tell kids, what's your dream job? What do you want to do when you're older? I honestly think the question should be, who and what are the sort of people that you want to work with when you're older? Because you can do the best. I remember years ago, it's a really boring story, but I got my dream job in radio when I was 23, and I was on silly money for back then, and I was terrible at it, and I was miserable, and I think that was a real sort of wake-up call for me to be like, it's not the job, it is the people.
Yeah. No, man, I think that's such an important lesson, because when you're in that situation, you're like, nothing's working out, everyone's going ahead in their career, people are getting more tours, people are selling more tickets, they're getting more representation, they're getting more digital projects, they're getting more brand work. When I look back now, I don't know if it worked out. None of it was because of my intention, because clearly if it left to me, the design left to me, I would have made a total tit of myself and signed up with everything. But when I look back now, I'm so glad it's panned out the way it has, because if I do decide to get back on stage, I'm going to do it through all those learnings, and and maybe even wipe the slate clean and just kind of learn what I did from those 13 years of stand-up, and kind of approach it with a fresh eye, and kind of remember, what we just said, be funny. That's all fucking matters, not being the next goat or being the next sheep or whatever you want to fucking be, and saying, how would Chappelle say the joke? And the first thing I would do is stop listening to comedy podcasts if I want to get back on stage, because it's just a mind fuck,
Absolutely, because I think this is the problem. Everyone pretends that they have the answers, and I'm saying that as someone that's postulating that that's my answer. I know nothing. Yeah. I'm a professional idiot. That's literally all I am. So don't come here for answers. Go and ask us sort of the Dalai Lama or someone, because I'm not someone that comes up with answers. I can barely formulate questions.
I want to ask you, what does comedy do for you?
Very, very good question. And I think the honest answer is it has changed over time. Because when I got into comedy because I was obsessed with watching it live. And what it did for me then was make things manageable. I loved watching stand-ups talk about being single or lonely or broke or a freak, because I was like, oh my God, you're kind of reframing that idea. You're actually saying, I don't fit in, and that's okay. And I think that's what comedy did for me back then. And I think over time, it's like so many things. Once it becomes your job, it can take away that enjoyment. It's like someone once told me, if you're a chef, you eat shit. Because if you're in a kitchen for 18 hours a day, you don't want to go home and do grilled lobster. You're just going to have beans on toast or quavers, So I think what comedy does for me now is, if I'm entirely honest, pops up, but in the most unlikely of places. This is why most comedians go and see weird shows because it's just something different. You know what I mean? A lot of comics will go and see surreal stuff that most general audiences will go like, sorry, what? Why is he talking into a pack of bacon? Whereas like comics are like, this is so different. This is the best thing ever. So
Yeah.
I think what it does for me now is I think it's like a little kind of reminder that, you know, things don't always have to be so serious. Why? What's it do for you? That's a really good question.
Um, I think that's another strange thing that I've realized now is that, you know, when I did get on stage for the first time, what comedy served was it served to get me the attention I wanted, um,
Mm.
which is great for a little while, but it kind of gets old. And I'm glad it got old pretty quickly, at least quickly in the sense, you know, as years go by, 5, 6 years. But it then served to kind of help me talk about and come to terms with kind of my visual impairment and kind of being okay talking about it publicly and also being comfortable saying this is what I have and not kind of brushing it under the carpet and not apologizing for it. Um, yeah, I think those are the two main things. But, you know, I did enjoy the laughter, but I never got to a place where I took absolute satisfaction from the things I was saying. So yeah, it you know, it's hard saying that because it almost says like, oh shit, that means 13 years was just basically massaging your ego and coming to terms with the disability. It sounds pretty fucking shallow, but I would definitely say that the making kind of using the opportunity of or the excuse of writing material to look within and kind of just address all the things that I hadn't. If nothing else, I think that would be the biggest sort of thing that comedy has done for me. And that's why I've kind of gotten to a place now where I don't need it for that. So I need to figure out what I'm going to use comedy for going forward.
I think for a lot of people, it is a great excuse to say silly things in order to, you know, like for me, I think that's actually a really good point of like, I remember when I started stand up, it was an excuse to do things that I would normally be more embarrassed about. You know, you hear people talking about like, oh, I was on a station platform the other day and I started talking to a dog and, you know, it's an excuse to do that. Like, this could be a stand-up set. But I also think, and you talked brilliantly about comedy podcasts. One of the best things I ever heard was Greg Davis was on a comedy podcast, and he said something that he said that comedy kind of almost gives him an outlet. And he said, and I think this is absolutely true of me, and it's something I don't like admitting, and it is horrible. I know that because I do stand-up comedy, I kind of feel that you get that attention, you get that ego massage, whatever. So I know that if I didn't do stand-up, if I went to the pub with mates, I would try and just take over. I would try and be the funny guy. Whereas like I kind of think that comedy kind of gives me that outlet so that I can go to the pub with mates and sort of just sit and chat and laugh. I think that's also one of the things that a lot of people can feel is a bit of an affront of like, I'm not going to laugh at them because that's almost appearing weak. That's appearing that they're above. And I'm not going to play those games.
I was totally that. I totally recognize myself in what you just said because that was the role I happily took up, right? Because I was using every opportunity to get the attention. And when that's your focus, the stage isn't enough, right? Because you want to get off stage, be funny than the other people. You want to put down others so you look more like you're shining. And it's just a never-ending beast that eats itself up, right? It's kind of all-consuming. And honestly speaking, you know, I really I'm glad I'm saying this now because I'm no longer that guy. I don't want to be recognized wherever I go. I want to have a quiet evening with my wife or with close friends, and I really do enjoy that. Not like I ever lived a life where I had people queuing up to get my selfie or autograph, but even the little bit of attention I got, it served its purpose then. It's kind of burnt out fortunately now, and who doesn't like attention, of course, but not to that level of this endless kind of need to kind of fuel this ego. But yeah, I'm glad that all of that happened because it has led me to where I am today, and I'm really excited of with what I'm going to or how I'm going to view comedy going forward, because hopefully it's just at this place where I just do it because I like telling funny shit. And if it means not as a stand-up, but just maybe a monologue or a spoken word or whatever the fuck it is, I'm excited to do that because I finally want to get to a place where I enjoy my material. And I saw glimpses of that in 2020, just before all this stuff happened, where I was telling stuff from life as opposed to making up stuff, saying, what if this situation happens in this situation? Maybe it's funny. I wasn't exaggerate. No, that's not the right word. I wasn't making up shit because I thought it's funny. I was actually talking about stuff from life and kind of just peppering it with a little bit of storytelling touches to make it appropriate for the stage.
That's amazing. I'm very, like, genuinely, that sounds more exciting to me to listen to than someone talking about train toilets.
Yeah. Unless, of course, that's happened to you. In which case you have to talk about. Oh, man. So it's intriguing that you, as a comedian or a person who's, as a comic, let's call it, so you've written this book now, and that documents your life and also you coping. You say with depression and with anorexia, right?
Yes.
So, what was that like? Like, where did that sort of originate? I wouldn't want to dramatize it and say your battle with depression, but your awareness that something is affecting you, keeping you down, keeping you in this loop of thoughts which aren't healthy, and as a result, even the other disorder, which is anorexia, it is quite. People think it actually happens to supermodels, but it's actually a very sort of scary place to be. So, can you talk me through that?
It's really interesting because I think we always sort of expect people who have problems with their mental health to just innately know. And I think, actually, like people, if you've got a hearing impairment, let's say, it's quite difficult to know what's normal. And it's only like over time, people will go, can you hear that? And you're like, well, I can't hear that. And over time, you realize that things that used to be loud aren't so. And it was exactly the same, I suppose, with my brain, that I realized that I hadn't felt okay for. Well, the honest answer is I realized that I got depression when I went to a mate's house and they were doing MDMA, and I never did any drugs. Never, I'd tried a spliff when I was 17, didn't work for me, not interested. And at that point in time, I was very, very anorexic. And I always said that I knew that anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any mental illness. And it was a passive suicide attempt. And I remember them sort of saying, oh, do you want to do MDMA? And I was like, no, because in case it goes wrong. And then I just had this thought of like, well, what happened? If it goes wrong, you've achieved your goal. So I took it, which was very out of character. And it made me realize, oh my God, this is what happiness can feel like. And I'm absolutely not condoning drug use. I'm certainly not promoting or encouraging it. But what I am saying is it's a very common trope for a lot of people that are struggling with their mental health. Something happens outside of their usual realm to put it into some sort of focus for them and make them realize, oh, things are a little bit off.
There is a different shade to life that I never knew existed. Yeah. So when was this? What was the kind of thing that helped you sort of guide you and kind of give you some sort of support to of course, I mean, look at your situation, to kind of make sense of it, to kind of pull you and guide you in the right direction? What were the things and the tools you used?
So I think for me, this was, I started developing anorexia when I was like 16, 17. And it took ages to take hold because I didn't realize what I was doing was abnormal. And it was only when I was like 20, 21, and I was working down in this, it's this boarding school down in Somerset. And I remember that they catered for all of your food. And there was no calorie count. There was nowhere to prepare your own food. And it was miles away from the nearest village. And I was just amazed how much I freaked out. And I started setting my alarm in the middle of the night to do exercises. I started skipping meals, and then I started binging and hiding food and then taking things to try and get rid of that food. And people noticed. And it was only until one of the teachers said, look, I've been in therapy for bulimia 3 times. Have you ever thought you might be anorexic? Because that's what this seems like. And that was the first time anyone asked me rather than told me. And I didn't do anything about it until I was 23, 24, because I never felt ill enough. And I think that's a very common trope for mental health, is that people feel that you have to be absolutely down and out to get it sorted out, which kind of grates me, because we don't take that with physical health. You don't have to be absolutely, unfit before you start going to the gym. Why do we always do that for our mental health?
Well, Dave, I think I'll let you go because you have this coming up. So people listening, if they want to pick up your book or they want to follow your work and catch your set online, or if they're in the UK, catch you live, can you drop those details before we sign off?
Thank you so much. Yeah, well, the book is called Weight Expectations, because I originally wanted to call it The Real Hunger Games, but that wasn't allowed. So it's called Weight Expectations, all about anorexia. And you can get that. And then all the details are davechawner.co.uk. And thank you so much for having me on
My pleasure,
this
Dave.
lovely
And
podcast.
yeah, it's absolutely been a pleasure chatting. And I hope we can meet again in the near future.
Yes, I would love that. And don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast.
Hey, take care, Dave. Talk to you soon. Good luck.
Care.
Bye.
See you later, mate. Bye.
Bye.